Part 3. Track came back to his seat with a large pie tin and a fork. I thought Allison was going to fall off the couch as she moved closer to watch him. My best friend was looking good in his own right, and coupled with his relaxed attitude and friendly personality, he usually had at least a handful of girls after him. He wasn't arrogant about his appeal, but he didn't detest it either. He scooped out a bite of the blackberry dessert and then turned and looked at Allison, whose eyes were glued to him. She blinked hard and sat back a bit, but still watched him as he put the food in his mouth and chewed it. He shook his head and shot me a look. "So, Allison," I said, drawing her attention away from him so he could consume his pie. Werewolves had more than a healthy appetite, and that pie was only a snack. "Have you ever been to one of Jonathan's clubs?" I mentally kicked myself for picking that subject, but I didn't have time to think of anything else. "Yes, Beamer's, and it's magnificent. It's a mixed-race establishment and is very hard to get into. I have been there twice," she stated, nodding to emphasize what an amazing feat that was. "I think I've heard of that place," I added. "It's about 2 hours from here. In the city?" She nodded. "Have you ever been?" "No, I actually never thought about going." She looked shocked, and I smiled. I didn't realize it was such a nice place. I had always thought it was a single-race, uppity club. I'm glad to see I was wrong. Yes, I was grasping, but I wasn't very good at making small talk with strangers. "Actually, you're only wrong about the single-race part," she chuckled. "Most of the people that go there just go to be able to say they got in," she explained, not realizing what she had just implied about herself. "Ah, well then, that's not really the type of place I enjoy going." "Where do you hang out?" she asked, stealing a glance at Track, who had quickly finished half the pie already. "Here is where I get to sound even more pathetic. Polson, usually. Track's town. It's just on the other side of the estate." I lowered my head a little, and Track grinned as he swallowed his last bite of pie and stood to put it away. When he came back, Allison was engrossed in him again, and I sat and watched her ogle him, jumping in to divert her when Track's body language asked for it. It was frustrating to have her here so long. I wanted to sit and snuggle up with my best friend and packmate. Being close was important to wolves, and it felt odd to be in this room with him for so long and to have to sit on what felt like opposite ends of it. I could tell he was feeling it too as he glanced up at me more often. Track and I turned and looked at the open double doors. Allison followed our gaze and then smiled as her mother walked in. We all stood, and Allison rushed over, taking her mom's hand and pulling her towards Track. She introduced him and then explained how he was a werewolf, as if her mother couldn't tell by his scent. Catherine shook Track's hand and exchanged a few friendly words with him, then turned to her daughter. "Come along now, dear. You don't want to impose on Reina for your first night here. Plus, I want to talk to you about something I heard." "About a maid?" There went that look parents give you when you're in trouble. I flinched at that. Someone had told her. Allison frowned and nodded, then looked at Track. "It was very nice to meet you. I hope I see you again soon," she smiled. Track mumbled something noncommittal, and Allison turned to me, beaming. "I'm so glad we're friends now, and I can't wait for tomorrow." My brows knit in confusion, but I nodded. Catherine tried to make light chit-chat for a moment, and then she and her daughter left. I walked up, shooed my bodyguards out into the hallway, and shut the doors, leaning back against them. "That was almost painful," I moaned. Track laughed and walked over to the movies. He took one out and popped it in the DVD player. then joined me as I sat on the couch. I snuggled up next to him, my head on his shoulder, and we talked and watched the movie, finally relaxed. When it finished, he yawned and I frowned. Werewolves did stay up later than humans, but they were not vampires. He grinned at me. Hey, can I help it if I sleep at night? I sat up and shrugged playfully. You could adjust your entire life and sleeping habits for me, you know. He stood. Really now. I'm sure Jonathan Hilver would be happy to adjust, was all he got out as I grabbed a pillow from the couch and smacked him with it. He laughed and headed to the window. Don't worry, I'll come and save you again tomorrow. I walked over as he punched the security code on the panel and then opened the window. I frowned, already missing him. He saw the look on my face and gave me a hard hug. You could come back with me, you know. You like to lay with me while I sleep. I always like it when you do that. Now, to any non-werewolf, that would sound like we had taken our friendship to the next level. But as I said before, werewolves were very closely knit. We craved physical closeness from our packmates. Another reason I would not be taking Allison with me to Track's place. There were very few female werewolves, so seeing me and a bunch of male werewolves all huddled up talking or watching TV wasn't a memory I want imprinted on her gossiping mind. Non-werewolves just couldn't grasp that it wasn't a sexual thing. Yes, sometimes it led to that if the werewolves were involved, but it was also just something that we needed from each other. It reinforced the pack loyalty and made us extremely dependent and yet comfortable with each other. Yes, I used we when I talk about vampires and we when I talk about werewolves. Gotta love being a hybrid. As tempting as that is, I chuckled, we have guests. You'll have to settle for rescuing me tomorrow. He nodded and hopped up on the windowsill without any effort. Are there really new wolves? I asked, leaning close to him, not wanting him to go. He nodded. Yep, 2. One is pack-born, one is a newcomer. Who? Chad, and the new one is Marcus, he stated, squatting comfortably in the open window. Marcus? I hadn't meant this one. He grinned. Yes, and he's just about the right age for you. He yelped as I pushed him out the third-story window. I chuckled, looking down as he landed lightly on all fours. Werewolves were a lot like cats that way. I waved with a sarcastic smile on my face, and he shook his head, also smiling. I leaned on the ledge as he turned, and I sighed as he ran off. I watched until the tiny dot was out of even my sight. A moment later I grinned and stood as a howl pierced the quiet night. I better see you tomorrow, I whispered, and turned back into the room. The door opened then, and my father walked in, first looking past me to the open window, and then to me. He walked up smiling. I see Track still can't seem to use the front door. He liked Track and was only teasing about the door, mostly. He used it on the way in, I said, a little more defensively than I intended. My father nodded. Jonathan arrives at dusk tomorrow. He stepped up to the window, shut and latched it, then punched a button on the security panel, the red light jumping to life. How? Closed car, he stated. That meant that non-vampires would be driving him, and he would be in the back in an enclosed area that protected him from sunlight. Either that, or he was wealthy enough to have a car with special glass that didn't allow the sunlight in. My dad had a fleet of them. I nodded, walking over and picking up the pillow I had used as a weapon. I tossed it back on the couch, and my father sighed. Reina, he really is a very nice boy. He'll be on the High Council himself soon enough. Being asked to take a seat on the High Blood Council was a huge privilege, but to be asked so young, and without an ancestor on it, was nearly unheard of. I sighed. Dad, really? He gave a soft chuckle and walked up to me. I stepped into his arms and he hugged me, kissing the top of my head. Sweetheart, do you have any idea how much I love you? I smiled into his chest. Enough to stop playing matchmaker? Is what I wanted to say, but I didn't. As much as it drove me crazy, he did what he did out of love. So instead, I looked up at him and grinned. I love you too. His smile slipped a little. I'm very sorry about that pet thing getting past us. I pulled away and shrugged. I really believe Allison didn't know. Regardless, it won't happen again, he stated, picking up the DVD cover from the floor. He glanced at the title, shot me a look, then walked over and put it back on the shelf. Track and I like to watch vampire and werewolf movies. It seemed a bit sick, but we got such a kick out of seeing what humans would come up with next. Plus, there was the ironic twist added if an actor or two was actually a non-human. I can still go to Trax tomorrow, right? They're welcoming 2 new wolves, I stated, careful not to use the word initiation since that word bothered my dad. Truth was, it was more like a welcoming anyhow. There were games, ritual dances, feasts, more feasts, and then a hunt. That was as dark as it got. He frowned. That's usually a 2-day event, Reina. With our guests here. I nodded, looking down. He grinned. My ploys were not always as hidden as I wanted them to be. You can go for a few hours tomorrow night. Then I want you back here. It was actually more than I had hoped for, so I smiled and nodded. One of my father's bodyguards walked in then. Mr. Belden, we've just received word that Jonathan Hilver is on his way here now and will arrive in a few hours, sir. I nearly yelped, but tried to remain calm. If I met him tonight, that would meet my obligations, and I could spend more time with the pack tomorrow. My father turned, one brow raised. No, Reina, he stated, making me balk. My father couldn't read my mind. It was just one of those weird things that parents did that always left us children a bit baffled. He turned to his bodyguard and nodded. Very well. Make sure his room is ready. Has his father been notified? He's the one that got the call, sir. My father nodded again, and the massive vampire left the room. Now, Reina, he stated, turning back to me and shaking a playful finger, I want you to be on your best behavior. I glanced at the clock. There was still a good 7 hours before sunrise. If it took him 2 hours to get here, that left about 5. I nodded, and my father shook his head. Do you know how many girls... He didn't finish that sentence. We both turned as Allison came running into the room, which again amazed me with those shoes. She came to a halt, seeing my father, and blinked. Excuse me, Mr. Belden, she stated quietly, her eyes moving to mine, and the sparkle in them told me she had already heard the news. My father chuckled, kissed the top of my head, and left. I'll leave you two to it then, he stated over his shoulder. As soon as he was in the hall, Allison reanimated. Did you hear? Jonathan's coming tonight. I nodded, with a solemn look that she didn't notice. He must be very eager to get here, she said, smiling at me coyly. To arrive an entire day early? I wrinkled my nose. Well, maybe he'll get a flat tire or 2, I whispered. Unfortunately, vampires have pretty good hearing, and she grinned. You can't mean you don't want to, unless... She glanced at the refrigerator, and I followed her stare. Track? I winced. He's like a brother to me. I felt my stomach tighten at the thought. She had absolutely no clue. So, what are you going to wear? She stated carefully. I looked down at myself. I was wearing black slacks and a dark blue silk top. I normally preferred jeans, but had worn this to greet my father's company. My feet were bare, and my clothes were a bit wrinkled from watching the movie with Track. I shrugged and looked at her. Is something wrong with this? She chuckled and took my hand. Let's go have a look at your closet, she stated, as she pulled me out into the hall. If that doesn't work, I'll have to see what I have. We look about the same size. I looked over at my shoulder and threw Andrew and Michael a silent plea for help. They both smiled and followed us quietly. Chapter 2. I sat on my bed and watched in awe as Allison went through my walk-in closet and threw out a dozen options. Next, she went through each of those, holding them up and talking to herself, if I had to assume, since she never waited for my response. She finally settled on a black skirt and a wraparound red shirt that still had the tag on it. I winced as she pushed them at me. At least try them on, she giggled. I was shoved, with my arms full of clothes, behind my closet door, and she chattered away while I slowly changed into the outfit. I looked down at myself, trying to remember the last time I even wore a skirt. Well, let me see, she chimed, and I trudged out. We definitely have to go shopping, but for now, that will do, she smiled, looking me over and smiling the whole time. Not too sexy, but also very flattering. I tugged at the neckline that showed a bit more than I was comfortable with. She winked at me and headed back into my closet. Where are your heels? I don't have any, I confessed, all of a sudden feeling like an Amazon fresh out of the jungle. She walked out, shook her head, took my hand, and we were off to her room. She tried to get me to try on heels that were as high as hers. I'd fall flat on my face, I stated. Finally, she settled for a pair of pretty flats that had a soft design over the toe. Suddenly, I felt like a Christmas tree, and gasped as she sat me down at her dressing table and started to mess with my hair. Now I had to draw the line. No, my hair is fine. I like it this way. My hair was very straight, and although it hung to my mid-back, I left it alone or put it up in a ponytail. For very special occasions, I had even been known to pin it back at the sides. But I felt awkward enough as it was, so she settled for brushing it. My skin prickled as she touched my hair. It felt like an invasion of privacy to me. She wasn't Pac. Track had brushed my hair a few times, and his little sister, Effie, loved to play with my hair, but that was different. I endured the torment until she was finally satisfied and freed me, only to start carrying on about what she was going to wear now. Her closet made mine look bare. For a trip that was only going to take 2 weeks at most, she had more clothes in there than I owned altogether. She finally settled on a red skirt that I thought was too short, and a white lace cami with a white cashmere top over it. She looked at me and then at herself and nodded. I couldn't tell if she wanted to make sure we somehow matched or make sure she wasn't going to outshine me. Either way, I was still baffled by the whole ordeal. I sat on a chair and listened to her chat away while she did her hair and makeup. The makeup part was actually interesting in an odd way. I found myself contorting my face and mimicking her expressions as she applied her mascara. Why was it easier to put that stuff on with your mouth open? Finally, all she had to do was pick out her shoes. Whoops, forgot who I was talking about. Exactly how many pairs of shoes did she have in that closet? I actually sighed in relief when Michael knocked on the door and told us that my father wanted to see me in the sitting room. He smiled when he saw me, but luckily didn't make any comments. Come on, I said to Allison, shooting Michael a look that said I wasn't going to go through this alone. He only smiled. When we got to the room, Michael reached for the door, and Allison gasped, then waved her arms wildly. He stopped and looked at her as if she had lost her mind. She ignored his reaction and quickly adjusted my shirt. flipped my hair over my shoulder, and then started to fix herself. I frowned and glanced at my bodyguard, whose brows were as high on his forehead. Finally satisfied, she nodded, and he opened the door. As we stepped inside, my father and two other men stood. One was Anton, so I assumed the other was his son. I had to admit, he was hot. He was only an inch shorter than my dad, and his hair was as black, though it was cut short in that trendy style that flipped up just a bit in the front. His gray eyes watched us walk in, and his smile was breathtaking. He looked like something out of a magazine, and I swear I heard Allison sigh behind me. The black slacks and a silvery gray shirt looked amazing with his hair and eyes. His clothes were expensive and cut to fit his muscular physique. He was not thin and wore his muscles well. The wolf in me appreciated that. My father met me, glanced at Allison, and then took my hand and walked me over. "Jonathan, this is my daughter, Reina Beldrin." My father smiled proudly. The vampire stepped up, took my hand, then kissed it. I wanted to laugh, but my father seemed pleased. "I am more than honored to meet you, Reina," he stated in a voice that was nearly sultry, but light at the same time, if such a thing were possible. I cleared my throat, removed my hand from his, and turned. This is Allison," I stated too quickly, but was glad I didn't make a complete idiot out of myself and forget her name. He turned his charm on her, and she nearly melted. Anton watched the exchange as closely as my father. Two dads, calculating how to force their children to fall for each other. I wanted to moan, but I locked my jaw and forced my eyes not to roll. My son runs many of the clubs here in the States, as well as sits on the minor council. He also handles a lot of my business affairs, Mr. Hilver explained, as if that should have sealed the deal right there. I recovered a bit and nodded. "Superman in a vampire's body. I am impressed," I replied with a polite smile that hopefully hid the sarcasm. "My father thinks much more highly of my accomplishments than I do, I'm afraid," Jonathan smiled. "I work hard and care about what happens in our world is all." "Why don't you take Jonathan on a tour of the manor?" my dad offered, as if the idea had just come to him. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner, and my father chuckled. "There's plenty of time." My mind raced with every possible excuse, but I felt my dad stare, and I could smell the excitement from the female next to me. Finally I nodded, and Jonathan's dad beamed. I shrugged and turned to his son. I guess we could show you the layout here." "I'd like that," he smiled, then turned to my father. "Mr. Beldrin, I want to thank you again for the letter you wrote to the council on my behalf." My dad's eyes widened a bit, and he avoided my hard look. "You 3, enjoy yourselves," he said, shooting a glance at Allison. She was too busy trying not to drool to notice. I took her hand, shot my dad a hard smile, then turned and headed out of the room, leaving Jonathan to follow us. My nose was wrinkled in frustration when we got to the hallway. Why did parents always do that? And why, for that matter, did he think I would be interested in this male? Hot or not, he was 100% vampire, and not just in his bloodline. I felt eyes on me and turned. Jonathan stood smiling at me, and Allison stood smiling at him. "Well, I guess we could start with the theater," I shrugged. "Actually, I've heard you have a rather nice kitchen here," he said, his gray eyes sparkling as he smiled. I nodded slowly, watching him closely for any signs of mockery. "I bet he'd like to see the security wing," Allison tried. I looked at her, suddenly reassessing her as an ally. She smiled at me, and we both turned to him, waiting. "Maybe after the kitchen," he stated, grinning at both of us as if he knew something we didn't, or at least that I didn't. "Okay," I replied, still a bit cautious. Having a kitchen in a vampire's home wasn't completely unheard of, especially if they bought through the regular housing market. We rarely had non-vampire guests, and if food was ever needed for them, it was prepared in the help swing, at least until my kitchen was put in. Our werewolf employees had their own kitchen. It was actually almost as nice as mine. We walked down the hall, and Allison smiled at Jonathan. "So where are your bodyguards?" I blinked and turned, realizing she was right. Andrew and Michael were behind us at a respectable distance, but they were the only ones there. He looked down at my blonde mini-yard. "I only have one, but I didn't see any need for him at this moment, unless you know something I don't," he teased her with a wink, and she nearly bubbled over. I frowned and bit my lower lip. Just great. I was the only one with walking tanks. He seemed to notice and flinched himself. Yeah, that lost him a few points. We reached the kitchen and Allison gasped as we walked in. The floor was tiled in exotic blue, swirled design, and the chrome and the black appliances were better than some fancy restaurants had. My dad had a thing about always having the best, no matter how humble he was about it. Allison oohed and awed over all of it, but Jonathan walked straight to the 8-burner stove with built-in grill and nodded. Gas stoves are always the best. They allow you better control over the heat. My brows rose, the surprise obvious on my face, but I didn't reply. He moved to the wall where 2 inserted ovens were housed. He opened one and smiled. "I smell pie, I think." Allison gasped. "How did you know? Reina made a pie for Track." She stepped up and inhaled the air as he held the heat-resistant handle. She shook her head. "I don't smell anything." "Was it a berry pie?" he asked me, waiting until Allison stepped back and then carefully shutting the door. I nodded, frowning. "Blackberry," I answered quietly, still a bit shocked by what was happening. "Did you pick them yourself?" Now I turned on him, fully expecting him to laugh or crack some joke about it. But again his eyes were sincere, and he looked genuinely curious. "No," I snapped quickly, and moved to the large island. I ran my hand over the marbled top, and wished Track had picked now to save me. We couldn't read each other's minds, but he always seemed to know when I really needed him. Unfortunately, he was asleep, and besides, there was no point in having him show up just now to get me out of a few awkward questions, I guess. "Track, you say," Jonathan stated, directing the question at Allison. Her resilience melted, and I couldn't even be mad at her for it. She gushed about my werewolf friend, and I ignored them as I stood, looking across the room and out the window. My jaws were clenched and my hands shook. I placed them on the cool marble countertop to steady them. Jonathan cleared his throat, and I turned, leaning back against the counter. By the looks on their faces, I had been asked something and hadn't realized it. "So, how about we show him the theater now?" Allison stated again, keeping her voice light, though her eyes looked worried. "The theater?" She nodded, and I did as well, pushing myself off. "Sure." As we walked down another hallway, Jonathan stepped up on my other side. One bad thing about large hallways. He glanced at the odd mixture of art on the wall, and then turned. "Allison tells me that you've never been to Beamer's." I shot her a look, and she nearly wilted. I sighed and gave a quick nod, walking a bit faster. "May I ask why?" "Ask all you want," my vocal cords ached to say. Instead, I just shrugged. "It's 2 hours away, and well, I usually stay pretty close to home." Ugh! I wanted to kick myself. I was trying to sound indifferent to his pompous club and ended up sounding like a small child not allowed to venture away from home. Jonathan only nodded, and Anders stepped up and opened one of the massive doors that led into the theater. There were 5 rows of seats, individual recliners set on declining rows so that everyone had a perfect view of the massive screen in front. Ander turned on the lights, and again Allison sighed and went on about how wonderful it was. The screen covered a full stage where, as they say, in days gone by, theater meant live theater. You couldn't see the stage right now, but it was still there. Track and I used to play on that stage. We would put on costumes, play with the props, and escape into many different worlds together. Jonathan, however, turned to me. "I'd like to take you to Beamer's while I'm here." I looked up at him and he smiled. "I am sure I can clear it with your father." Great. Now I was a pathetic child with a warden for a father. He turned and looked towards the door. "With your bodyguards and the security I have in place, I'm sure your father will see that you'll be perfectly safe." My brows rose now, as did my hackles, or at least they would have, if I had any. It was more a figure of speech. He just smiled at me. "You are a very important vampire, Reina. I know you realize that. The only daughter of the great Thomas Beldron. I don't envy the way that must have limited your life, but I would like to help you escape it for a night, if you'll let me." Great. He better not be this nice, or I was going to make hating him a lot harder. Allison stepped up, and he turned his smile on her. "How about I talk to Reina's father and your mother and see about the 3 of us having a night out on the town?" Allison actually clapped her hands together and bounced on her toes. I watched in a dumbfounded stupor and wondered if she practiced that in the mirror. Her blue eyes sparkled up at him, and then she turned them on me. "Oh, great," I moaned internally. "Oh, Reina, please say yes. My mother would never let me go without you. Not that I would want to go without you, that is." Guilt was such a powerful weapon. To the movies that said the vampires had no feelings because we didn't have beating hearts, I say, I wish. At least sometimes I wished. Why in the world humans believed that a large muscle in your chest that pumped blood was the requirement for having a soul was beyond me. It pumped blood, not morals or ethics or feelings, really. I also found it ironic that those same stories depicted vampires showing anger and rage. Last I heard, those were emotions. And I am going to stop there before this gets too long. Hope you enjoyed.